Chapter 6. The Chief is Dead. Long live the Chief. He got to school early by running all the way. The first thing he did was head to the school library shelves for a book on Indians, and to his joy he soon found one under the section labeled Peoples of the World, a book called On the Trail of the Iroquois. He couldn't take it out because there was no one there to write him down for it, but he sat down then and there on a bench and he began reading it. Now, Omri was not what you call a great reader. He couldn't get into books, somehow, unless he knew them already. And how, as his teacher never tired of asking, was he ever going to get to know any more books until he read them for the first time? And On the Trail of the Iroquois was not exactly a comic book. Tiny print, hardly any pictures, and no fewer than 300 pages. Getting into this was obviously out of the question. So, Omri just dipped. He managed to find out one or two fairly interesting things straight away. Iroquois. Iroquois Indians were sometimes called the Five Nations. One of the five were the Mohawks, a tribe Omri had heard of. They had indeed lived in longhouses, not teepees, and their main foods had been maize and squash, whatever those were, and beans. These vegetables had, for some strange reason, been called the Three Sisters. There were many mentions of the Algonquins as the Iroquois' enemies, and Omri confirmed that the Iroquois had fought beside the English, while the Algonquins fought for the French sometime in the 1700s, and that both sides had scalped like mad. At this point, he really began to get interested. The book, in its terribly grown-up way, was trying to tell him something about why Indians had done such a lot of scalping. Omri had always thought it was just an Indian custom, but the book seemed to say that it wasn't at all, at least not until the white man came. The white man seemed to have made the Iroquois and the Algonquin keen on scalping one another, not to mention the white men, French or English as the case might be, by offering them money and whiskey and guns. Omri was deep into the book, frowning heavily, several minutes after the bell rang. Someone had to tap him on the shoulder and tell him to hurry in. The morning seemed to last forever. 3 times his teacher had cause to tell Omri to wake up. At last Patrick leaned over and whispered, "You're even dreamier than usual today. What's up?" "I'm thinking about your Indian." "Listen," hissed Patrick. "I think you're putting me on about that Indian. It was nothing so marvelous. You can buy them for a few pence in Yaps." Yaps was their local news agent and toy shop. "I know, and all the equipment for them. I'm going shopping at lunch break. Are you coming? We're not allowed out of school at lunch unless we eat at home. You know that." "I'm going anyway. I have to." "Go after school." "No, I have to go home right after school." "What? Aren't you staying to skateboard?" "Omri and Patrick, will you kindly stop talking?" They stopped. At long last, lunchtime came. "I'm going. Are you coming?" "No, there'll only be trouble." "I can't help that. You're a twit." Twit or not, Omri snuck out, ran across the playground, through a hole in the fence, and in 5 minutes, by running all the way, he had reached Yaps. The selection of plastic figures was good. There was one whole box of mixed cowboys and Indians. Omri searched until he found a chief wearing a cloak and a full feather headdress, with a bow in his hand and a quiverful of arrows slung across his back. Omri bought it with part of his lunch money and rushed back to school before he could be missed. He showed the chief to Patrick. Why get another Indian? Only for the bow and arrows. Patrick was now looking at him as if he'd gone completely mad. In the afternoon, mercifully, they had 2 periods of handicrafts. Omri had completely forgotten to bring the teepee he made, but there were plenty of scraps of felt, sticks, needles, and thread lying in the handicraft room, and he'd soon made another one, much better than the first one. Sewing had always bored him, but now he sat for half an hour stitching without even looking up. He was trying to achieve the patched look of the real teepee, made of odd-shaped pieces of animal hide. And he also found a way of bracing the sticks so that they didn't fold up when they were nudged. "Very good, Omri," remarked his teacher. "What patience you have all of a sudden." Omri, who usually liked praise as much as any other kid, hardly heard her. He was concentrating so hard. After a long time, he became aware that Patrick was standing over him, breathing through his nose noisily to attract his attention. "Is that for my Indian?" "My Indian, yes." "Why are you doing it in bits like that?" "To be like a real one. Real ones have designs on them. So will this. He's going to paint proper Iroquois ones." "Who is?" "Little Bear. That's his name." "Why not call him Running Nose?" asked Patrick with a grin. Omri looked up at him. "Because his name is Little Bear," he said. Patrick stopped grinning. He frowned. "I wish you'd stop this stupid business," he said, going on as if it wasn't a joke. Omri went on looking at him for a moment, and then went back to his stitching. Every pair of sticks had to have another short stick glued between them. It was quite tricky. Patrick stood a minute and then said, "Can I come home with you today?" "No, I'm sorry." "Why not?" "Mom's having guests," Omri mumbled. He didn't tell lies very well, and Patrick knew at once it was a lie, and it hurt. "Oh, all right then, be like that," he said, and he stalked off furiously. The afternoon ended at last. Omri accomplished the walk home, which with normal dawdling took half an hour, in a little over 10 minutes. He arrived sorely out of breath and greeted his surprised mother. "Have you developed a jet engine, or have you been expelled from school?" with a lot of gasping and a request to go straight to his room without waiting for tea. "What have you been up to up there? There's an awful mess on the floor. It looks like grass and bark, and where did you get that beautiful little Indian teepee? I think it's made of real leather." Omri looked at her, speechless. "I," he began at last. Telling lies to Patrick was one thing. Lying to his mother was quite something else, and he never did it unless an emergency was dire. But mercifully the phone rang just then, so he was spared for the moment. He dashed upstairs. There was indeed a fair old mess, though no worse than he often left himself when he was working on something. Little Bear and the horse were nowhere to be seen, but Omri guessed where to look, behind the dressing-up crate. A wonderful sight met his eyes. A longhouse, not finished, but no less interesting, and a beautiful one. It stood on top of the seed box, whose smooth surface was now much trampled over. There were hoof and moccasin prints. Omri saw that a ramp made of the bark had been laid against the side of the box, of which the horse had been led. A tiny pile of horse manure lay on the ramp as proof of the horse's passing, and there he was, tied by a thread to a twig hammered into the ground. He was munching on a small pile of grass that the Indian had carried up for him. Little Bear himself was still working, so intently that he didn't even notice he wasn't alone. Omri watched him in fascination. The long house was about half finished. The twigs which had been taken from the birch tree were stripped of their bark, leaving them shining white. Each one had then been bent into an arch, and the ends were thrust into the earth, and cross pieces were lashed to the sides with thread. More and more twigs, which were stout poles to the Indian, had been added, with never a nail or screw needed, to strengthen the longhouse. And now Little Bear had begun to fix flakes of bark like tiny tiles onto the pieces. He was seated on the roof, his feet locked around the main pole, which ran the whole length of the house, hanging these little bark tiles, each of which he would first carefully shape with his knife. The knight's battle axe lay on the ground. It was clearly used to chop and strip them, and had been made to serve Little Bear's purpose very well. At last, Omri saw him straighten up, stretch his arms towards the ceiling, and open his mouth. in a tremendous noisy yawn. "Tired?" he asked him. Little Bear got such a fright he almost fell off the roof, and the horse neighed and tugged at his rope. But then Little Bear looked up and saw Omri hanging over the crate, and he grinned. "Little Bear tired. Work many hour. Look, make long house. Work for many braves. I make alone. Also, not got good tools. Axe gave Omri is heavy. Why no tomahawk?" Omri was getting used to his Indian's ungrateful ways, and was not offended. He showed him the teepee he made. "I suppose you won't want this now that you've got your long house," he said. "Want, want!" He seemed to have decided teepees had their uses. He circled it. "Good! Give paint! Make pictures!" Omri unearthed his poster paints. When he came back, he found Little Bear sitting cross-legged on the earth, facing the figure of the chief that Omri had put next to the teepee. Little Bear was clearly puzzled. "It's plastic," said Omri. "I bought it in a shop." "Plastic?" Little Bear stared at the figure with its big feather headdress. "You make magic? Get bow and arrows? From plastic?" "Yes." "Also, make feathers real?" he asked. "You like that headdress?" Little Bear like, but that for chief. Little Bear not chief till father die. "But you could just try it on." Little Bear looked doubtful, but he nodded. "Make real, then see." Omri shut the Indian chief into the cupboard. Before he turned the key, he leaned down to where Little Bear was examining the enormous pots of paint. To him, "Little Bear, are you lonely?" "Huh? Would you like a a friend?" "Got friend," said the Indian, jerking his head towards the horse. "I meant another Indian." Little Bear looked up, his hands still. There was a long silence. "Wife?" he asked. "No, it's a man. The chief." "Not want," said Little Bear, and went back to his work. Omri was disappointed. He thought it might be fun to have two Indians, but somehow he couldn't do anything that Little Bear didn't want. He would have to treat this chief as he had treated the knight, grab the weapons, and turn him back into plastic once again. Only this time, it wasn't quite so easy. And that's not the end of the chapter, but that's where I'm going to stop. Omri has just placed the chief into the cupboard to retrieve his headdress and his bow and arrows. And in this picture, if you can see it, this is Omri looking over the longhouse that Little Bear made while he was at school. So we'll have to see what happens when Omri opens the cupboard to see the chief tomorrow. Have a good night.